Hi, my name is Lulu DeBoer. My given name is Carol. And my father was a American Peace Corps volunteer, and he married an Ikiribas woman, my mother. So here I am today, a product of the Peace Corps, as it were, or as you kindly call them, Peace Corps kids. I've heard them referred to as Peace Corps babies as well, but yeah, there's a whole generation of us, I suppose, out there. So, my mother's from the small island of Kiribati, and it's like on this very far edge of the map, over there. And Kiribati it's no longer part of the Peace Corps, but it was back in the day. And yeah, it's a small atoll island. I would say the Peace Corps and America in general has been fairly good to that country compared to the other countries in the region. So, yeah, Kiribati is an interesting place. It's actually the subject of my upcoming feature documentary, Millennium Island. So if you want to see more of that, find me on YouTube. So my father is originally from Iowa, and my mother is Kiribati but Tabitaoan, so that island region specifically. And Tabitaoans have a sort of like a warrior caste ethos about them. They're known as the Island of Knives. And my family actually moved down to Texas when I was 7, and I like to think of Texas as the state of guns. So it's a pretty interesting way to look at conflict. Yeah, we actually spent most of my childhood in Gilmer, Texas, which is a small town in rural East Texas, about population 5,000. And it was a very interesting experience growing up in a small town in rural America, being biracial, as it were. There's really no other Kiribati people around that area. The language was really only spoken in my home between my grandmother, my mother, and I. And yeah, the family unit was made up of my mother, my father, my grandmother, me, and my little sister. And my younger sister, she's the middle sister, I have another one now, but that was like a couple years later. My middle sister is actually my first cousin on my father's side, so my father's sister's daughter. And she, as a first cousin in Kiribati culture, is considered a direct sibling. And we adopted her when she was 2 and gave her a Kiribati name. She was originally named Ashley, and we named her Kerita, or KK for short. And now that she's grown up, though, she's reverted back to being Ashley. So I think that's an interesting departure we took as siblings. Whereas I was really curious in my college years about reconnecting with Pacific culture and going back to that part of the world. And she was really curious in her college years on reconnecting with white American culture and what does that mean for her growing up. And I always found it pretty interesting that the two of us, even though we grew up in the same circumstances, were treated very differently in public. Well, America, first and foremost, just has a long history. You know, it was a country built on slavery and genocide. So there's a lot of issues that this young nation of 200 years has to contend with. And those issues carry into everyday lives of many American citizens. So growing up in East Texas, there's kind of like 3 categories you could be in, like white, black, or Latino. And because we were neither of those or like some combination, we were just other. Obviously my little sister was white, so she was considered as part of the white margin. And then when her and my father and I would go around town, the 3 of us, they would assume I was the adopted sibling. And so it was an interesting kind of way of looking at that. One time, though, I was with my father and my sister in Iowa, and I guess my father's community in Iowa knew about him getting a Peace Corps, some exotic wife off in the islands. So they assumed that wife was me at age 16. So that was a really awkward moment in church when people were like, "Oh, so Gary, this must be your lovely wife." And I'm like, "No, I'm his lovely 16-year-old daughter." So awkward. It's interesting because I think Peace Corps is full of those idealistic young people, and they come back and they have all that bright idealism, and then they make decisions based off of that could affect their whole life. And then once that idealism fades away a bit into the conforming back into the American culture, they start to realize that there's a lot more problems that they never even anticipated before. So I don't think my father really knew what he was doing by creating a biracial child in America, and I still think to this day he doesn't quite understand the challenges of that. I was in the marching band, and so our small town of Gilmer was celebrating the Jamboree, which is like the biggest festival for the county. And him and my little sister were walking around trying to get a sandwich. We walked into a sandwich shop and were invited to stay for a meeting. It was a closed meeting, private group. And they said, "Oh, sorry, the sandwich shop is closed, but you can join our meeting." Turns out it was like a KKK affiliated group called the Brothers of the Confederacy, which was actually a pretty big group in my small town, and they gave a scholarship to all the high school students every year. But yeah, so when my dad came home, he brought back that brochure kind of as a souvenir, like, "Ha ha ha, isn't this funny?" And that just struck me with a lot of fear. It wasn't funny. But yeah, so that's kind of an interesting environment. Physically, I guess I'm usually interpreted to most Americans as Latina for whatever reason. Mostly the Texas connection. And statistically, I'm like, okay, that's a fair assumption. So yeah, I was kind of raised in that guise and didn't really have much contact with other Kidibos people. It was really in 2000, during the Millennium celebrations, that was the first time I actually saw Kidibos on television and the islands themselves, and like kind of had that feeling, oh, there's more out there than this small town of 5,000 people in the woods. So that was kind of the impetus, as it were, like the jump off moment. And at that young age in my life, I was like, you know what, I want to do something about Millennium Island, because it just felt like that little island on TV really inspired me to go back. And then the climate change dialogue started picking up as I went through high school and college, and it was more and more this Anante-Tong rhetoric of doom and gloom, like our islands are sinking, climate change is going to wipe us out, this sort of like ticking clock that it felt like, oh, well, if I need to reconnect, I need to do it now, otherwise there might not be a later. And that was kind of a big inspiration, as it were, to go back. I guess in some form I did follow in the steps of my Peace Corps father, and I went back to Kidibos for 2 years. I actually wanted to join the Peace Corps, but they didn't go to Kidibos anymore, so I was like, well, I'll do it myself some other way. So I followed in his footsteps, went back for 2 years. For work, I'm a filmmaker, and I graduated from Stanford with a Bachelor's of Arts with a major in film and a minor in music science technology. So I knew very, very quickly that that was my medium to express things most fluidly. And going back and making a documentary called Millennium Island about this narrative really opened my eyes to the way that we talk about identity and narratives. So when I was working with the American Indian Film Institute, I studied very much this idea of the anthropological documentary and the idea of like one culture filming another, and what does that mean if one culture has more power over the other, and how does that affect the films that are being made? Almost like overwhelmingly so. Documentaries made by outsiders tend to be more negative, sadder, doom and gloomer, a little bit leaning towards the poverty porn spectrum of liberal documentaries. Whereas indigenous films tend to be a little bit more hopeful, a little bit more focused in their approach of what they want to see done, and a little bit more positive about the communities in general. So I definitely saw that happen with Kidibos as a case study in climate change narrative. And for the longest time in my film, I was struggling with, I think a lot of Peace Corps struggle with, this sort of white savior complex of I'm Western, I'm well educated, I know better, let me save you. Right? So I went in there with like really good intentions, like, okay, let me go there, listen for a year and see how I can help. And I did that, and then I got a bunch of opportunities from like Tesla's nonprofit write-off, Give Power. So they were like a solar panel company that really wanted to do something out there, and I like tried to collaborate with them and tie them in with the Kidibos government. And I realized as I was going through that whole process, like, yes, I might put one solar plant on one island and feel good about that. It might not be what the country needs, but I was like so hell-bent on getting that white savior feeling of like, I did something here, something tangible, let me go talk about it. And that really comes across in the 5-minute piece that I presented right before Note's art. Like the words, the last words, if I, your humanity, failed to save you, just remember I loved you. Because I felt like it was my responsibility with all this privilege coming from the West to like try to save something. And fast forward a couple of years, a little bit more introspection, I'm like, that is not necessarily the right approach. Like the Pacific Islanders have their own way of dealing with this problem, and so I've been listening more and more to what my mother's doing on how to fix some of these solutions. And I think I don't really have the clearance to tell you at the moment, but eventually, like maybe next year, you guys will all hear about it. There's like a whole inter-island deal going down to help with some of these climate refugee crisis issues. So I thought that was an interesting thing too. And once you see something, you can't really unsee it. So once I noticed those tropes and tendencies within myself, I definitely noticed them in other films.